What's up, guys? This is the Board Game Roamer bringing you Ceti Planetary Crisis today. It's a game published by Outer Limit Games, created by Mike and Stan Strickland and Joseph Picus. It is a 4X space game. You're playing one of 6 factions vying for control of the Ceti Authority. Aim of the game, you're trying to, at the end of the game, have the most galactic points, which is essentially what you're trying to sway everybody to your cause with. You do this in a number of ways, using some not really new mechanics, but new takes on some existing mechanics that I think are really neat, very different. You're going to have a home world. You're going to have planetary crisis, as the name says, are going to happen each cycle, which is essentially a round where everybody goes and takes all their actions. That's going to affect an economy-driven matrix of various commodities that you can buy and sell, that also determine amounts you pay for things like repair and things of that nature. There is a thread on BGG by Joseph Picus, and in that thread he kind of compares this game to some similar games because it does use a lot of mechanics that are existent in other 4X space games, but there are plenty of things, especially with the crisis tokens that you use in this, that really set it apart. So I think that this game is not something that is just going to be another run-of-the-mill 4X space game. It's going to be something you guys are really going to enjoy because it's got something new, but familiar enough that it would even be, I think, a good gateway game. But it's Ceti Planetary Crisis. Let's go to the table and see how this baby runs. What's up, guys? Before we start the actual rules, I just wanted to go through and kind of show you the components, the major things that we're going to use to set up the game before we actually set it up. Instead of doing it as we're doing the setup, I just personally like that style a little bit better. Kind of helps me cement in my mind what we're doing when we set that up, and it just makes more sense to me. But so this is your faction map. This is essentially your faction's control panel for the game. This map is going to track everything that you do. It's going to track your tau, which is your money. On the left hand side you can see a track from 0 to 9. On the right hand side it's going to track your energy, again a track from 0 to 9, and that tau and the energy points that you have are going to be used to perform actions or potentially pay for an action or something that happens with an action. So if you look and you see on the center part here, there's a row with some icons. It says REC, REF, REP. Those are actions. So you have, in this particular faction, we have it in a certain order. Every faction's order will be a different order. So for instance, the other faction may not start with recruit. They may start with interplanetary mission, or they may start with upgrade or something like that. So there is some differences on the map, but all the components, all the pieces that we're going to talk about on the map are present on everybody's faction map. So you have these actions in the center: recruit, refuel, repair, interplanetary mission, explore, build, upgrade, and sell or buy. And again, we'll talk about those, each specific action and how that's done later, but those are actions that are available to every faction. You'll notice that the track is only 0 to 9. There are these tokens, right? These little plus tokens right here. And these tokens, what they do is, as you go up the track and you increase and you get past 9 and you start to go on 10, 20, 30, 40, there are 4 slots over here by each track. You simply put that token there to denote that you have whatever the value is. So for example, nothing on the track says I have 5. On this first I have 15. The next one I have 25, etc., etc. So that's how you track your tau. Same thing for energy. You have the same track over there. Now you will notice that there are kind of 2 open spaces. These tokens actually don't go there, but there's 2 open spaces. The primary first open space we need to talk about is this space down here. This space is essentially your commander, the leader of your faction. Every faction actually has 3 different cards, right? They all have 3 different cards. I have the Terran faction here, so I'm just going to show you one card. This card has a ton of information on it. So each card has the name of the commander. It's going to have 2 numbers at the top. In this case, it's logistics and diplomacy for this particular commander. So if you pick this commander, what that means is when you do various actions, they're going to have different checks that are going to require you to do die rolls when you're doing especially exploration primarily, but some other things too. Interplanetary missions and things of that nature. And that number is going to determine how many dice you roll in order to hit some target number. So the higher that number, the better off you are. Now, what you're going to notice is that on all 3 cards, I won't show you the other 2 cards, but on all 3 cards for each faction, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see these 2 numbers, right? The 12 and the 10. That represents the amount of starting money, tau, and the amount of starting energy that you're going to have on your player mat. So you're going to set those up. Then you're going to see your competitive advantage. In this case, logistics is my primary competitive advantage. But then if I do any diplomacy rolls, I'm going to roll a 3. There are several different types of checks, and for anything that's not on this card, so anything that's not logistics or diplomacy, you're going to roll 2 dice, right? That's the standard. You're always going to roll 2 dice for most things other than battles, and we'll talk about those later. But you'll also notice that there are 2 powers right after the competitive advantage of logistics and diplomacy. A little bit lesser advantage, but an advantage all the same. So you got those 2 powers, and again, each commander, right, of your faction is going to have a different set of powers. So that will go right here and stay there for the game. So you also notice on that card in the bottom right hand corner, there's a value there. It looks like a shield with a number. That shield with a number is the galactic points. That is what you're trying to score at the end of the game to determine who's the winner and ultimately who leads the Tau Ceti in the lore. So certain different cards, when we start talking about the specialist cards and the crisis cards, we'll see that symbol. But just know that symbol denotes galactic points. So at the end of the game, you're going to get 1 because you have that faction leader. Each faction track is going to have some amount of galactic points, depending on if you have enough excess tau or energy at the end of the game. Now, I will say, just so you know, that when you're looking at the faction mats, not all the factions have exactly the same numbers. Some have fewer points at the top end. Some have, have to get further up before they even start getting points. But that's okay. That's part of it, right? So every faction is different. Every faction has things that they're better at than others. And again, like I said, their energy values and materials values and things of that nature are all going to be different. So that's going to determine how many extra tau and energy that you have. Now, the next thing we'll look at here. So just to kind of go with this says I have 12 tau. So let's set this up like we're doing it to begin with. So that's 10 plus 2. That's 12. Then on the other side, it says we have 10 energy. So I'm going to put that at the 0 and the 10. And then on every mat at the very center, there's another track here just below the actions track that is your materials track. And this track is going to be what's used to determine what you pay when you recruit specialists, which is one of the actions, or when you build orbitals, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you always start with that triangle, so I'm going to put that token right there. So the board's basically set up. There is one piece that is not set up, and that's these cards over here. So I'm going to show you a couple of these cards. So when you're playing the game, you will pick a start player. I believe the start player is the last, the player that most recently watched a science fiction movie. But you're going to have a start player, and the start player is going to get a cabinet card. And there's 6 cabinet cards. And this is the first player card that's the president. So what you do is on each cycle, at the beginning of the cycle, when you pick the cabinet members, whoever's going to be the first player, and that's going to rotate each cycle, so everybody will get a chance to do that. You're going to distribute the other 5 cards, the cabinet cards, to everybody else that's a player. Now each one of these cards essentially matches up with something that you can do in the game. It may have to do with trade, it may have to do with commodities, energy, tile, things of that nature. Each one of them are going to give whoever has it a special power, or a couple different special powers, things that are immediate effects that they automatically get, and things that are persistent that happen over the course of the cycle. So if you look at this card, for example, this card is the Trade Negotiator. So as soon as you get this, whoever is a Trade Negotiator is going to take a commodity for free. Okay, and then its persistent effect, anytime another player takes the sell buy action, you may sell buy the same commodity. So that makes you a little bit better at trade. But you notice it says third player at the top. So the distribution of these cabinet cards is going to determine the player order. So the first player is going to have the president card. He's going to hand out these cards, and whoever has the second player, which is Energy Envoy, is going to go next. Third player is going to be the Trade Negotiator. Fourth player is going to be the Financial Secretary, so forth and so on, until you go through all the players that are playing. All right, that's going to be the order that you take your actions. So speaking of commodities, let's talk for just a second about commodities. So down here at the bottom of the track, very bottom, you've got 4 spaces. There's a little bit of glare there. I apologize for that, but that's the best I can do with the light I've got right now. But you've got these four spots, and you can essentially think of this not really as cargo, because there's something else called cargo, but this is where you store your commodities, right? There are 6 commodities in the game, and each one of these commodities, for example, this commodity, right? Each one of these commodities essentially ties to one of the economic pieces of the game. So we're going to talk about it here in a little bit, but you have this this Galactic Depot, and you have the Ceti Exchange. And the Ceti Exchange, each cycle, is going to determine the value of various commodities. So for instance, this algae here, right? It's got, you see the algae, but you also see that symbol. That symbol is on the Ceti Exchange. And so when you're selling or you're buying those kinds of commodities, the value that you're going to get either for them if you're selling them, or you have to pay if you're buying them, is going to be determined by the exchange. But as you buy and sell them, you're going to need to track them. So for instance, let's say that I bought 2 algae. When I buy 2 algae, I'm just going to put it in the 2 slot here. Right, it's going to sit there. The maximum you can have of any commodity is 4. So once I get 4, that's as many as I can have, unless I sell some, and then of course I can buy back up to 4 if I need to. But that's how you track it. There is not a limit to the number of different commodities you can have. So like I said, there's 6. So you may have, 2 or 3, or you may have, say, 4 algae and 4 telepathic generators, which is what the blue ones are. So you can track that. Maybe you got 2 of the first ones right there. So there's various numbers of those commodities. You'll also you see here, I've actually got 2 sets, right? So there's 2 sets of tokens here. These wooden tokens on the right are the standard edition tokens. This represents your ship. These represent orbitals, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, these orbitals are going to, once you build them using the build action, in this case right there on the player mat for the Terrans, is going to generate you income. It's going to generate you tau at a specific point in the game cycle. That's the standard tokens. If you got the premium edition, deluxe edition, then you will get these plastic tokens, and you will get this plastic standee that has the spaceship for each faction. Each faction is different. They have a very different look to them. Per the rules, really the intent is for you to use 4 orbitals. That's going to be your max. However, and this is not part of the rules, but I just feel like it's worth mentioning. If you decided that you wanted to open it up and kind of house rule and say, hey, you can build more, if you get the deluxe edition, now you've got 8 orbitals. So that's just something to keep in mind if you decide to do that. The last little bit that I want to show you, components wise, and then I've got a couple more things I want to talk about on the board, but the last little bit that I want to show you are these little cubes over here. Okay, and these cubes, all right, just a regular standard cube. These cubes represent your economic influence in the Ceti system. And so what happens is at the beginning of the game, you are going to take, the game comes with 6, all right, one of them is just an extra. So at the beginning of the game, you're going to take 5 of these cubes and put it in a bag. All right, so we'll take these 5s, I'm going to put it in a bag. Each player that's playing puts all 5 of their cubes in the bag. For each non-player that you're using, so if you're playing solo, then you would, for all the factions that you're not using, put 2 cubes for those. Okay, or if you are playing with multiplayers, let's say you're playing with 3 people, then all 3 of you would put in your 5, and then the other 3 factions would have 2 that are put into the bag. So what happens is there's a couple phases. In the beginning of the crisis phase, you randomly pull out a cube from the bag, and if a crisis occurs, and like I said, we'll talk about the specific steps later on, but if the crisis occurs, then whoever's cube that was pulled out is going to have that crisis affect their planet, and that's going to affect the exchange. It's going to raise the price of the specific commodities. It's going to do some things to kind of mess with the economics for that turn, and that effect is actually going to stay persistent until you resolve that crisis. So if you are not resolving crises very often, what you're going to find is the things are going to be a lot more expensive. The demand for the commodity is going to be a lot higher, which may work in your advantage if you're selling, but it may not work to your advantage if you're buying. And there are reasons to do both buy and sell. The other 2 tokens here that we have are these 2 right here. We have an exploration token and a battle token. Okay, so when you choose an exploration action, which is one of the actions that you can do, that's where you're on a tile and you're going to explore it, some points on the tile, to see what kind of knowledge you can gain, and in doing so eventually you'll be able to build orbitals. But you're going to, if it is a what they call a route that has exploration points that have 2 that are connected, you're going to explore the first one, and then if you're successful, then you're going to put this token with a flag on the other one, just to let everybody know that you're going to be exploring it so they don't. Also, once during a cycle, you can do combat, and that's what this token is. So you would lay that token down on a hex that you want to initiate combat with another player and resolve that combat during your turn. The last couple pieces are up here at the top. Each one of these pieces represents a system of your ship. There's a weapons system, shield, computers, propulsion, cargo, lab, weapons. There are, if you get in battles, and there are even some other exploration tokens that will initiate this, but if you get in battles, the weapons is what you're going to use that will determine the number of dice you roll. Shields, the way shields work is when you're doing attacks, you're going to be able to, based on the level of your shields, which in the Terrans currently they have 1 level weapon, level 1 shields, I would be able to, in one of these 6 spaces at the top, put a marker that would say, I'm going to protect this system, and if that system happened to be hit with a hit during battle, it would protect it from that. Computers are used to navigate. Shields are also used during navigation. There's some hazards as you explore space, asteroid fields, cosmic rays, things of that nature. Propulsion, that's going to determine the number of hexes that you can move. And you'll notice in this case, Terrans start out with 2 propulsion, and then cargo, that's used for transport missions to determine how much money you make when you do a transport mission is also a 2. But and it may be hard to see here, but if you look under each one of these, where it says weapons, we've got this military symbol. Computers, we have a different symbol. So each one of these systems, right, weapons, shields, computers, propulsion, and cargo, are all tied to a system. And when you're upgrading the system, which is one of the actions you can take, again, you're looking at that Ceti Exchange, and you're looking to see what the value is of that particular commodity that's associated with that system, and that is use a real simple formula to determine what the cost is to upgrade those systems, or potentially, if the systems are damaged, the cost to repair those systems. So that's the player board. I'm not going to talk about the lab right now. We'll talk about that later, but that's the player board. So hope that helps, and let's go on to the next component. Alright guys, now let's talk about the Ceti Exchange. The Ceti Exchange is the economic engine for the game. This is where you're going to track the different levels of each of the commodities and what they're tied to, and we're going to determine how much you pay to repair things, or if you're doing a buy-sell action, how much you're going to pay to buy, or how much you're going to get for selling different commodities. So let's start at the top. So at the top are the crisis tokens. At the beginning of the cycle, there's basically 2 pieces to each cycle. There's a crisis phase, and then there's an actions phase. In the crisis phase, you're going to determine a home world through another process, and you're going to determine if a crisis occurs. And if a crisis occurs, it's going to match one of these 6 crises, and you're going to take one of these tokens, and you're going to place these tokens on a planet that you determined earlier when you pulled a cube out of a bag. So when that happens, that's going to affect this exchange. So on the back of these, you're going to see there's 6 different ones, and on the back there's each of the 6 different markets, right? Each of the 6 different symbols. So on the back of these, you're going to look at that symbol, and you're going to determine what that symbol is, and then you're going to adjust the market up by 1, whatever that symbol is. So let's say that you picked one of the crises, and it matched that first column symbol on the back of that token. You would take and move that white marker to from 1 to 2 to say, okay, now the market level is 2. So from that point on, anything that you buy or sell, let's say that you're trying to sell a commodity and then it's still at 2, well, now you're going to get 2 for it. If you're trying to buy one, now you're going to have to pay 2. So that's what this does. The next line down, you see the track that says 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 12. That's the number of cycles. So when you start the game, you're going to determine the number of cycles that you want to play. You can play a set number of cycles, or you can go for a longer game and do, say, 9 cycles, 10 cycles, then roll, see if you do an 11th cycle, and then roll and see if you do a 12th cycle. If you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. So that's what that tracks. So at the end of each crisis phase and then action phase, you're going to move that cycle marker up. Like I said, the bottom is the track that keeps up with that. You also notice at the top of the track, right, so you have the marker, the 1, 2, 3, 4, but at the very bottom you have the symbol that has to do with the market, and then at the top you'll have a symbol that's associated with a commodity. Basically that happens with both of these. You have a commodity and a market that are together, that are you think of those really as one unit. So one of the other things that's neat about this game that I haven't really talked about yet, that will make more sense when we start talking about the actions, is that each one of these symbols is actually tied to a specific faction. You can think of each one of these commodities, each faction has a different one, as their competitive advantage in the marketplace. They're better at buying or selling, or they have more of a particular commodity. So if you're, and they're color-coded as well, so that makes it a little bit easier. So if your faction is doing a calculation based on, like, let's say buying or selling, right? So if you your comparative advantage is that first column, that algae, and you're trying to sell it in the markets at 2. Well, you'd actually be able to sell it for 3. Everybody else will only be able to sell it for 2, but you'll be able to sell it for 3. And if you're trying to buy it, everybody's going to have to buy it at 2, but you only have to buy it at 1. So it is nice in that it gives you an advantage, especially if you're doing objectives. Maybe you get lucky and your particular commodity is one of the things that you have an advantage in. But it is a good way to buy and sell and make money. And also, when we look at the phases, you'll see this, but there are certain actions that you can use one of these commodities to enhance. So, for example, the recruit action. You can spend, when you do the recruit action, a telepathic generator, and instead of drawing 1 crisis card and 1 specialist card, you can draw an additional specialist card. So you get 2 specialists and 1 crisis. So there are advantages to having these commodities. So that's how that works. Now, if you'll notice on the left and right side, you'll see something that says crisis and specialist. That's where the decks go. So now let's talk about the cards. Alright guys, now let's take a look at the crisis cards. Like I said, on the Ceti Exchange you saw 2 different types of decks, the crisis deck and the specialist deck. I do not show them here, the backs of these cards, but what you will find is that the backs of these cards and the action cards that we'll also talk about all have the same backs. The only way that you're going to know what they are is if you look at the fronts of them, and that is intentional because when you're determining a crisis and you're contributing cards to the crisis during the phase, everybody will contribute cards into a stack, an active deck is what I believe it's called, and that will be the deck that you draw. You determine what's going to happen. So what will happen with the crisis is everybody's going to contribute cards. They're going to get energy for each card that they contribute to that, and you can contribute any card that you have. It can be an action, it can be a crisis, it can be a specialist, it could be an action, doesn't matter, it's going to be face down. And that deck, what you do is you'll shuffle it so that nobody knows who contributed what card, and then you will determine what crisis occurs. So the way we do that is we're going to look at on the top left hand corner in the green, you will see an icon, and that icon will match one of the 6 icons that were on those black crisis tokens. So you're going to look for those. You will see in the top right hand corner, the name will be in the center, but in the top right hand corner is a number. So if there's ever a question about the order in which these are resolved, or if you ever have multiple crises that are not resolved with specialists, which I'll talk about the specialist in a second, but if you have a number of these cards that are, say, 2 nuclear cards that are left after you resolve everything, and you're like, oh no, which one do I choose? Well, you choose the one with the highest value. That's how you break ties. So that's how that works. Also, you'll notice it's kind of got two sections, an initiate and an effect section. So when you contribute it, there's some flavor text that'll talk about. The bottom half, though, is the effect. So if the crisis does occur, you will take whatever the effect it says for the crisis is. It can be anything from you might remove all the existing knowledge tokens of that particular crisis. People may take damage depending on the home world. If they're so close to the home world that the crisis happened on, several different things can happen. So if the crisis does occur, you'll place the token, you'll pull it from the Ceti Exchange that we just saw, you will place it on the home world, you will change the exchange based on what's on the back of that token with one of the 6 economic types, and then you will do whatever the effect says and apply that effect. Once that's done, then you will start the second phase, which is the action phase. So that's really all there is to the crisis cards. Not anything super complicated about those. So now let's take a look at the specialist cards, because the specialist cards are what counteract these crisis cards during this first phase. Alright guys, so let's talk about these specialist cards. So as I said, these specialist cards are kind of the other half of the crisis equation, if you will. So as I said, you will play crisis cards, but also you can contribute during the crisis phase. You can contribute the specialist cards. Now, one thing I do need to mention about the crisis cards is that the only time that you can play those is during the crisis phase. If they're not played at that point, then you can't play them until the next crisis phase. On the top left-hand corner of the specialist cards, almost exactly the same setup as the crisis cards. Again, we have a specialist, and that specialist is going to match one of the 6 crises. Now, what happens during the crisis phase is, let's say that during the crisis phase, I played an atmospheric crisis. One of the green cards in the top left had the atmospheric icon. If I had played a specialist that matches that icon, it cancels out that crisis, so that crisis does not happen. We prevent that crisis. Now you also notice on the specialist cards that we have a circle at the top under prevent and a triangle and resolve. The circle, that stands for the crisis phase, which says the card can only be played during the crisis phase. The resolve, the triangle, says that that's during the action phase, which means it can only be played during the action phase. Now, you also notice that under resolve, they all say this, all of the specialist cards say this, but in effect, you can combine a specialist card with an atmospheric knowledge token or a nuclear knowledge token or whatever knowledge token matches the particular specialist, and by contributing that token, which we'll talk about how you get those at a later point in this video, and this card, you will remove that crisis from the board, and in doing so, you will gain some victory points. You will also, when you do that, that crisis being removed will change the exchange. So if you remember when we talked about the crisis phase, whenever a crisis did occur, we flipped that token to the backside. We saw one of the 6 symbols that matched the economic track, if you will, and that changed the Ceti Exchange. So for instance, if it was in my example before, the green algae, it changed that first column from a 1 to a 2. Well, if that crisis at some point in time is resolved by using one of these specialist cards and a knowledge token, and contributing those, then those go away, those get discarded, but you get to resolve that crisis. That crisis then is put back on the stack in the Ceti Exchange at the bottom, and you will get points for that, and the Ceti Exchange, in this case, if it was the green, it would drop that value now from 2 to 1. So that's how those work. Also, one of the things that I want to mention about this card that I did not mention about the crisis tokens, the crisis cards, but it's the same in both cases, is in the bottom left-hand corner, you will see a galactic point icon. Those are worth 1 point. So at the end of the game, any of those that you have in your hand, they are worth galactic points. But obviously, what you would rather do is you want to, with a specialist, spin those to resolve crisis, because you get more points for resolving a crisis than you do those cards on their own. But, they are there, so it may be more advantageous for you to get rid of one over the other. Maybe, you've got somebody that you're the other person that you're playing with, and one of the other people you're playing with, you're like, I really want to put a crisis on their home world that they need to deal with if you play with some of the advanced rules. Because actually, at the end of the game, when you're calculating galactic points, if you have any crises on your home planet, those will actually deduct galactic points from you. So you want to get those resolved, especially not just for the points, but especially if they're on your home world. So there are reasons where maybe you want to contribute those cards over, say, a specialist card, and keep those specialist cards for potentially resolving a crisis. Of course, in order to do that, you have to have the knowledge token to go with it, or when we talk about the knowledge tokens, 3 of those knowledge tokens of whatever the crisis is also. But so that's the specialist cards, and the specialist cards that that I'm showing you here and these next set of cards are actually all part of the same deck, but since they are a little bit different, work a little bit different, I did want to show them separately. So let's take a look at the other cards, the action cards. Alright guys, so these are the other action cards. What you will notice in the top left hand corner is that these symbols actually match the symbols for the actions that you can take. So each turn, if you remember the player mat, there were a series of actions: buy, sell, move, refuel, repair, etc. that you could take. These cards allow you to take those actions. Now, so you might say, well, why do we have these cards? Well, we have these cards because these cards will allow you to take this action during your turn, in addition to the 4 actions that you get using your normal 4 actions that you get in a turn. So, for instance, maybe during my turn, I said, hey, I want to take a move action, maybe 2 move actions, an explore action, or repair action. But then, I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, maybe I want to buy or sell, but I've already used my 4 actions. If I have one of these action cards, I can actually play this card during my turn, and I can basically do that action. Now, you still have the same rules as you do for every other action. When you take an action on your mat, you have to pay some amount of tau or maybe some amount of energy. When you play these cards, you still have to do that, right? So you still have to have the resources to take the action, but these cards allow you additional actions. Now, when you're playing, you do have a hand limit of 7, so you can't just stock up on a bunch of action cards and use those, or a bunch of special. You have to manage your hand to decide: do I want to keep more crisis cards to use against people? Do I want to keep more specialist cards to resolve them, or more of these action cards so I can do a little bit more on my turn than I normally would? When you play these cards, or when you play a specialist card or you play a crisis card, those cards are gone, right? So they're effectively discarded when the phase is over. Action cards are a bit different in that when we play these, they go in front of us, right? We play them during our turn. We can use them at any point during any one of our 4 any one of our 4 turns where we play 1 action per turn. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the actual gameplay. But on our turn, we can play these and then we can use these, or we can play these and we can wait. And then at the end of our turn, any of these that we have that we've played can go back into our hand. Now, if during the course of that, let's say that we took several recruit actions and now we've got maybe 10 cards in our hand, we do still have to discard down to a maximum of 7 cards. So, maybe you drew some stuff, a crisis card or maybe a specialist card that you got a token for and you'd rather keep that. You may have to sacrifice one of these action cards, but they are still very handy in getting you the ability to play extra actions. Now, the other interesting thing about these cards is that you will see it lists not only in the top left corner the icon that matches the action, but it says what the specific action is. So this one on top here says action repair, but the cost is listed there as well. And typically, not necessarily always, but typically the cost to play these action cards is a little bit higher than the actual cost of the standard action. So, and again, that makes sense because we're really kind of playing these in excess of the 4 actions that we normally get, but they can really, really help you, especially if you're trying maybe in the last couple cycles, you're really trying to complete your objective cards and you need a couple commodities, but you really need to be moving. There's several things that you need to do, and you don't quite have enough actions to complete that 1 or 2 actions that you really would like to complete to kind of solidify your lead or really get you a lot more points. This is a way to do that. This is a way to do that because we play these cards and we're able to take that action, assuming we have the resources to pay for it. Alright guys, let's talk about these tokens. These tokens will make more sense here in just a minute when we start talking about the depot and the actual tiles that we're going to be using. But the top left token is a knowledge token. There are 6, you should already know this by now, there are 6 tokens, 6 different symbols. And this is a knowledge token. You're going to be exploring the hexes and drawing some cards that you're going to make some rolls, and you're going to be trying to get this knowledge, gain this knowledge. You will gain these tokens. They will sit there. You will own these, and then you will play a specialist card with these if there's a crisis that matches this. So in this one, this particular token that's flipped up, if I have a specialist card that matches that symbol, and there's a crisis also somewhere on the map, it does not have to be on your home world. If there's one that exists anywhere on the map, then I can I can solve that crisis. Okay, resolve that crisis. And I would do that by either spending a specialist card and this knowledge token, or let's say that I had 3 of this particular knowledge token. I could also use 3 of these knowledge tokens to do the same thing. Now, to the right of the token, the blue circle and the red circle, the backs of these knowledge tokens are going to have either a blue circle or a red circle. The red circle is used on a specific tile, which we'll talk about later. The blue circle is going to be used pretty much everywhere else. So what you do is at the beginning of the game, you will shuffle these. You'll take one of each and put it on the Galactic Depot, which we'll talk about next. But you'll shuffle these, and you'll spread these out into the main system, and you'll have some set aside left over to set for the outer limit tiles, which we'll also talk about. And those will be placed there, and I'll show you how to do that. To the right of that, you see one with a red circle. The red circle, as I said, is for a specific tile. We'll talk about that. To the bottom are two tokens that are shuffled in with the knowledge tokens. And these are fleets and patrols. All right, and these kind of represent pirates that are out there that are trying to, either get resources or basically slow you down. So there may come a point in time, and again, when we start talking about specific actions you can take in exploration, we'll talk about this more in depth, but you may flip one of these over, and that's going to initiate a battle with these guys, and you're going to have to resolve a battle using your weapons and your shields and potentially taking damage, or hopefully, if you can, getting rid of them and being able to continue exploration especially if it's one of the exploration points that has 2 points in order for you to complete before you can build, gain economic influence and orbitals, which we'll talk about later. Before you do that, you've got to get rid of these guys. So that's how they work. We'll talk about them a little later. But I wanted you to see these tokens before we started talking about the Galactic Depot. Alright guys, this is the Galactic Depot. On the top of the Galactic Depot, you will see one of each of the 6 different types of knowledge tokens. You'll start the game by placing, for setup, you'll place 1 token there of each type. Below that, let me go back. You'll place 1 token of each type, and then as those tokens are either spent or through a crisis, if it says they have to be returned, this is where you're going to return those tokens to. Below that are the upgrades. Okay, so on the player mat, if you remember, we had 6 different systems. So each one of these tokens that you see here is an upgrade, which is one of the actions that you can take to one of those systems. Now you'll notice that there are a different number of pips on each one of these particular ones that we see here. Some have 3, some have 4. What that is the effectiveness of that system. So let's take the far left, the triangle, and let's look at it first. It's got a 3. So if I had this on my player board, when I'm doing any kind of check that involves weapons, I would be rolling 3 dice, assuming that it wasn't damaged. And that's how I would know how many weapon dice to roll. If a system is damaged, and it does not matter what the system is, if any system is damaged, you subtract the amount of damage from its effectiveness. So in this case, let's say the dark laser, which is the one that we see here, let's assume that's on the player mat. If I had 2 damage on it, it would effectively only be 1. So anytime I'm using, having to do a weapons roll, if I've initiated battle with another player, or maybe I found one of the patrols or fleets that we talked about, instead of rolling 3 dice, I'm going to be rolling 1 dice. Like I said, one of the actions that you can take is upgrade. You're going to figure out the cost of this, and on your player mat, underneath these icons, underneath the shape, the weapon, movement, propulsion, computer, all that, you're going to see one of the 6 economic symbols, and there's going to be a formula that you use to determine what it's going to cost to upgrade. and we'll talk more about that action. But this is where those tokens are located at. Now, there are only 2 of each level, so there's only 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s. So there are a limited amount of tokens, and if you go strictly by the rules, then you're supposed to upgrade in the order that your system is. So if you have say a level 1 system and 2 other players have already taken the level 2 upgrades, if you go strictly by the rules, then actually you cannot upgrade that system. So you do want to, again, you want to balance everything out here. You've got to manage your upgrades, you've got to manage your resources. There's just a lot of different things going on, which is what I like about the game, is you have so many different things going on that it's not just, one solid strategy is going to win you every time. At least as far as I've found, that's not true. So let's take a look at another component right now. Alright guys, what I want to show you now are the Hex Tiles. Here are some of the Hex Tiles that you will use for the main system. In the top right hand corner, you're going to see what these kind of look like when you put them all together. So all of these different tiles are going to interlock together. You'll notice that there are some tiles that have planets, some tiles have galactic points, some have exploration points, some don't have either one of those. But we're going to talk about those specifically, starting with the top left one. So the top left one is the Ceti planet, and that is going to be the central starting point when you're laying out the map. All the other main system, which are these larger hex tiles, are going to go around that system. It doesn't have to be, you're not making the same map every time. You can shape it any way you want. Players will take turns placing it, but the Ceti is basically going to be the starting point of your map, and you're going to place around that. You also see some homeworlds in the top right, the top row, middle hex is an example of one of the 6 homeworlds. You will see that there's some galactic points listed there, and those galactic points are going to be how many points you get for the cubes at the end of the game. You also see a box just to the right of the homeworld. This is where we're going to place commodities. So at the beginning of the action phase, you're placing commodities onto each of the 6 worlds. That is driving change on the Ceti Exchange. So when you place those commodities, you're going to, 2 things are going to happen. On the first turn, you're going to get 2. On all subsequent first cycle, you're going to get 2. All subsequent cycles, you're just going to get 1 of the commodity that you see that's on your home world automatically. And every turn, every cycle, you are going to take whatever commodity is on each of the 6 planets, homeworlds, and it's going to increase that particular commodity's value on the Ceti Exchange. Which, again, that could be good or bad. That you may have, bought some at 1 and now they're worth 3, or the opposite may be true. You may be trying to get those, and maybe you've got an upgrade that you want to do, so you're really hoping this cycle it's low. But that's what those are for. The top row far right is a special planet, and if you remember, we just talked about the tokens, the knowledge tokens that had the red circle on the back of them as opposed to the blue. There are 6 of those, and you will take those, you'll shuffle them together, take the top 4 and put them on that planet, and those actually will have their own special cards when you go to resolve those and search for those. So that's what those are for. The bottom left, bottom row, far left is an asteroid. That is there for some special planetary missions and some things. We'll mention that one specifically. Now, you will notice in the bottom row middle hex that it's kind of a little bit different. So you see what look like asteroids there, and in fact those are asteroids. So what happens with that particular hex, or any hex that has those asteroids on it in that kind of density, is that when you move in there, you are going to be using your you're going to be using your computer to navigate through those asteroids so that you don't take damage. So what happens is you're going to roll a dice, and on a 5 or a 6, you do not take damage from those asteroids. If you do, in fact, fail that roll, then your computer will take a point of damage because you took damage going into the asteroid field. Now, once you're in there, you can take any action you want. You don't have to roll again, and you can exit freely and not have to roll again. But when you enter in any hex that has that asteroids in it, you do have to make that roll. You will notice that there are a series of exploration points here, and they're connected by a blue line, and they have this circle in the center. And what that is there's going to be 2 exploration tokens on each end of that, what we're going to call a route. Okay, so when you explore, you're going to explore one of the 2. You're going to flip it over. You're going to resolve that exploration to see if you get the knowledge token or not. But you can also lay down, if you remember way back at the battle faction mat, you can also lay down your exploration token onto the other part of that route and say, hey, I'm going to explore this one next, and nobody else can go in there and explore that one and take it away from you. If you successfully explore both of those exploration points, or one has already been explored, maybe they moved off or they did something else for some reason, they're not there anymore, and there's only one left and you explore it, then you get to pull one of your cubes from the bag that you placed at the very beginning when you started out of the bag, and you place that cube in that circle, and then at that point, at a later action, you can choose the build action, which will allow you to take from that point that cube. That cube goes on your home world, and you put an orbital there. That does a couple different things. First thing it does with the orbital there is that if it is there at the ending of all the cycles, it is going to generate you points for galactic points. Also, at the beginning of the action phase each cycle, you are going to be generating additional points for tile and energy. Alright guys, let's take a look at these tiles. These are the outer limit tiles. This particular outer limit tile has cosmic rays. You'll see basically 2 kinds of hazard tiles. The first is the asteroids, which we've looked at. Again, you use computers to navigate through the asteroids. Any tile that has this cosmic ray, this purple pink cosmic ray, utilizes your shields to protect you from it. So again, it's the exact same way that you deal with asteroids. Instead of using your computer power, you're going to use your shield power to negate that. You're going to roll, and on a success, which is a 5 or a 6, then you will not take any damage from that. You'll also notice that these tiles at the bottom, you'll see the galactic points show 2, and that circle, the 4-pieced circle there beside that, represents orbitals. If you remember back in the beginning when I showed you the wooden tokens that did not come with the premium edition, the orbitals had that same symbol, and that's telling you that on this tile, for each orbital that you place there, you will get 2 galactic points. Now, what you will notice is that on most of the outer limit tiles, perhaps maybe all of them, I can't remember right off the top of my head, you will have an exploration point. Okay, and so if you explore that point, then you will be able to add a cube there and eventually build an orbital. Now you'll notice that one of the cool things about the outer limit tiles is there's not 2 points to explore in order to get that, but you'll also notice that they're only worth 1 galactic point, or excuse me, 2 galactic points typically. One of the other important things, and we would talk about it in movement and building, but it is how you explore and the order that you build your orbitals, and then you do the exploration to be able to put those cubes out that represent your economic influence is crucial. So as you're playing, you have to start in a central system hex tile. Okay, one of the original hex tiles you place, the bigger hex tiles, and you will explore. Once you explore there, you can then take a move action to move out into the outer limit tile, and you can explore there. Now, in order to build an orbital there, in order to get that orbital built, you have to be connected to another tile from the central system that has an orbital or influence cube. Okay, you can't just jump and hop and skip and go, completely different sides of the map or anything like that. Everything has to be connected. The best way to remember it is if the route gets cut from where you can trace back to a route on the central system, then you cannot place any more you cannot place any more orbitals or gain any economic influence. Okay, you need to keep that in mind, because this is going to make these tiles a lot more strategic in the way that you place them. So that's the cosmic tile. Next, we're going to look at another outer limit tile that does have some different things than the asteroid, and these are only two tiles that are like this this next one. Alright guys, these are the wormhole tiles. Again, this is an outer limit tile. You will notice that it also has an exploration point, and it has the 2 galactic points for the orbitals as noted in the bottom. What's special about this tile is there are only 2 tiles like this, 2 wormhole tiles that are outer limit tiles. But you can use these tiles to traverse from one tile to the other. So maybe these tiles got drawn on their complete opposite ends of the map. You could go in on one wormhole tile and you could come out on the other. So it's a good way to move around if they're not placed close together. Otherwise, they function the exact same way. Again, the same exploration rules apply. You have to have a route and then connect to that route back to get the economic influence with a cube if you successfully explore there, and potentially build an orbital there. So that's the wormhole tile for the outer limit tiles. Alright, these tiles are actually specific to the outer limit tiles. These are called dark matter tiles. So for every time that you place a outer limit tile, you will place one of these dark matter tiles. Now, what makes these dark matter tiles kind of unique is that even though they are separate tiles, any dark matter tiles that touch each other are considered one space. Okay, so whether there's 2 or 3 of them connecting to each other, as long as they're connected, they're considered one space, and you can move, traverse them just as you would with a normal move action. So if you look at this picture, you'll see we have a system tile. We have 2 outer limit tiles, and they're connected by 3 of these dark matter tiles. So from that central tile, I can go into the dark matter tile and go to the wormhole. That would be 2. Or I could go straight into the cosmic tile, go into the bottom left with 1. Or I could potentially, if there was, let's say, another dark matter tile connected to the, another outer limit tile connected to the dark matter tile that was not connected to either one of those 2 outer limit tiles, I could still go there. That would still be moving into the dark matter is 1, moving into the tile that would be touching it is 2. So that's how the dark matter tiles work. Very important. When you place an outer limit tile, you place these. You do not have to place the dark matter tile touching the outer limit tile that you place. So you could actually strategically build maybe somewhere else as you explore, if you've got a plan to get back, or maybe you can utilize a wormhole to get back, and you've got a really good propulsion score so you can do a lot of movement or something like that. So that's how the dark matter tiles work. And again, when we do the playthrough, I want to do one of those. Hopefully I'll be able to show you exactly how that works. Alright guys, just got a couple more things to talk with you about, and I'm going to end this video. These cards that you see right here, these are the crisis cards. So you will notice on the backs, the 2 cards to the right, those backs are 2 of the 6 symbols that you see on the knowledge token. So what's going to happen is when you do an exploration action, which we'll talk about in the next video, you will take one of these cards and you'll flip it over, which is what's on the top left hand side, and it's going to tell you what you're going to check. So in this particular case, this card says check your diplomacy. Now below you, below those cards in the bottom row, I've got 3 of the leader cards from the factions. So if you notice the card to the far left, diplomacy 4, right? So that's their primary advantage. So they would roll 4 dice. The card in the center has diplomacy as a secondary skill, so they would roll 3 dice. The card on the far right on the bottom does not have the diplomacy skill, so you're going to roll 2 dice. So what you're going to do is you're going to roll those dice. If you roll a 5 or a 6 on either one of the dice faces, however many dice you roll, as long as at least one of them is a 5 or a 6, you're considered successful. And the symbol that's on the very bottom of the cosmic card that looks kind of like a circle with an hourglass that's blue and purple, that's the success symbol. That means you get that token. Then you're going to add the total value of all the faces of the dice. So let's say that you roll a 5 and a 3, right? That's 8. So you would look on the card and you would say, okay, what does 8 give me? In this case, 0 to 8 actually is a penalty as opposed to 9 plus, right? So when you're rolling, it is possible that you'll be successful in generating the tokens that you need, what you need to pass the test in order to get the token. But you may possibly get some benefit from it, or you may not roll high enough and you may actually suffer a little bit. Either way, you do get the crisis token, and that's the only way to do anything with the crises, so that is good, but that's how those cards work. So let's take a look at the next set of cards. Alright, these cards are the objective cards. When you set up the game, at the very beginning, each player will receive 2 of these objective cards. These objective cards are secret to you, and this is a way to score additional galactic points at the end of the game. There are really there's several different types of cards out there. A pretty big stack of objective cards. But what you'll notice is that on each card, most of them are going to have to deal with commodities. So you can see in these cards in the top right and the bottom left that we have 3 galactic points if we gather 4 of each of the 3 different commodity types listed. And you'll also notice that in this case there are 2 commodities that are the same, okay, on both of those cards. So in this case, you've actually kind of got a little bit lucky in that if I get 4 of a commodity, I'm going to satisfy the requirement for both of those cards at the same time. So that is an advantage on the objective cards. So if you get lucky enough, that may be a thing to do. You have basically the fewer commodities that you have to get. Now keep in mind, I have to have those by the end of the game. So it doesn't mean that I cannot get them during the game, and I don't have to allocate them or anything like that. I can still spend them during the game. Like for instance, you see the Telepathic Generators there, the blue icon. I can spend that to draw extra specialists when I take certain the recruit action. I can do that all game as long as by the end of the game, by the end of the last cycle, I have at least 4. And as long as I have 4 in each one of the 3 depicted commodities, then I will get those points. You also see in the bottom right, if you have the 20 tau and you give the 20 tau up, that's going to give you 3 galactic points. So there are multiple paths to get some extra points there at the end of the game. So let's take a look at the next piece. Alright guys, let's take a look at the Interplanetary Missions now. So here you're going to see at the top there's basically 2 types of interplanetary missions. The first type, which is the one on the left, is really very similar to the knowledge tokens, the cards that you pull for that we looked at just a minute ago. And so you're going to do a check just like you would do a check for those. So in this case it's a diplomacy check, and again in our example, depending on whether it was a primary, secondary, or if you did not have that skill, you would use that to determine how many dice you roll. And in this, you're not adding them together, you're just looking for a success. Alright, so if you roll a 5 or a 6, then hey, you've succeeded. You'll get, in this case, this card's showing 7 tau. If you fail, there's a penalty for that. These cards are very good if you do not want to use commodities for whatever reason. You can make some money on these. Or to the right, top right, is another type of interplanetary mission, which is a transport type mission. So the good thing about these is you are basically taking your starting point, and the card's going to tell you where your starting point is and your ending point is, and you're going to travel the shortest distance between that point and where you're going. and you're going to generate money like that. You're transporting something, and it'll tell you what you're transporting. So when you do that, what this utilizes is this utilizes one of your systems, and that's your cargo. So you would take, it's got a formula there on the card, but basically you'll take the distance, you'll multiply it by your cargo value, and that's how many tau you'll get for that transport mission. And you will end on wherever the ending planet or space is. That's really nice. That's a good way to A, make money, and B, it's also a way to move around the board potentially, sometimes to your advantage, sometimes to your disadvantage. But you are going to be moving around. You will not take damage if whatever the path is, it takes you through some cosmic rays or some asteroids. You will not take damage for moving through those, so that is a plus. But that's Interplanetary Missions. Let's take a look at a couple more things, and then we'll be good for this part of the video. Alright guys, I'm going to take a look at 3 more sets of cards, and then that will complete this. These cards are exotic tech cards. If you look on your player mats, you'll see that when you upgrade, each time you upgrade, you move your material markers to the right. And once you upgrade all the way to the very end, going as far to the right as you can go, that qualifies you for one of these exotic tech upgrades. These are very powerful upgrades, and they're very powerful in different areas. Typically, each of the upgrades kind of like focuses in on a specific system or type of something you can do, whether it's movement or transporting or something like that, shields, weapons, whatever. These are really good to have. Of course, you do have to upgrade all the way, which means that you kind of have to forego building orbitals to get to this, and then, of course, after you get to this, then you could start doing it. What you need to know about these is once you get one, that is the only one that you can get, and you keep it for the rest of the game. So that is something to go for if you want to do that. Now let's take a look at 2 more sets of cards. We're going to take a look at diplomacy cards next. I don't know why I said diplomacy cards. I meant advanced rule cards. So one of the things that's really cool about the game is there are 6 advanced rules. Now these are rules that you can choose to play with or not play with. I would suggest that when you first start playing and you're learning to play, maybe forego these. But these really do add not only a layer of replayability to the game, but they also add a good bit of tactics and just really kind of change the game up. So once you're familiar with the game, once you feel comfortable with the basic rules, I would highly suggest that you incorporate these advanced rules to really make your decisions count. So there's 6 here, and they'll do anything from, most of them have to do with how we're going to calculate galactic points at the end of the game, penalties or bonuses that we may incur for different things that are on the board. There's a couple, for instance, one of them has to do with actions. If you have a crisis on your planet, you have less actions potentially. So it's real good thematically to include these, and I think that they really do add another layer of strategy to the game. So I would recommend you use these once you're familiar with the rules. The next set of cards that I want to look at are the diplomacy cards. Alright guys, these diplomacy cards, all these diplomacy cards are actually the same. You can only get 1 diplomacy card during the game, but these cards, instead of taking one option during one of the actions, and again in the next video we'll talk about what exactly your options are and how you get this card, but this card will allow you to draw 2 specialists instead of a crisis. Normally when you draw a recruit action, you use a recruit action, you're drawing 1 crisis and 1 specialist. These cards will allow you to instead draw 2 specialists. So it's a good way to, if that's the route you want to take and you really want the specialist, this is a good way to get them. You are foregoing potentially some galactic points. Excuse me, but it may be worth it because if you have a lot of specialists in your hand, you may be able to solve more crisis, get more crisis tokens on the board. So, again, it's just whichever way you want to go with it, but it is a good option for you, and it's really fun. I've played several games, and sometimes I do actually forego, and sometimes I don't. It just depends, but that's what the diplomacy cards do. And I got two more documents I want to show you. The first is the Alien Faction Guide. And what this guide is going to do is this guide is going to show you which factions have what commodities as their comparative advantage. So if you remember way back at the beginning of the video, we talked about the comparative advantages that a faction has. So if your advantage is in, say, Telepathic Generators, then when you buy or sell, you get one more for it if you're selling it, or it costs you one less if you're buying it. So this booklet will show you exactly who gets what. Also, a resource that I would highly recommend you check out was posted by Mike Strickland on the BGG forums, and it is this document here, which is essentially that booklet, just in a one-sheet page. Gives you a little bit more info, so it's all right there together on one sheet, and you're not flipping through the book. So definitely check that out if that's something that you want to do. I think once you start playing, you're going to notice that each of the commodities, of course, they have a different symbol for the commodities on the Ceti Exchange, and the commodities look different, but color, they all match, right? So the blue matches the blue faction, the gold matches the gold faction, etc., etc. Now, the reason I recommend you get this sheet is obviously if you have somebody that's colorblind or has a hard time distinguishing, there's different types of color blindness, so that's a hard time distinguishing between some of the different colors. That's not really going to help them. So this guide has the symbology that you would need to determine, which faction has what. So I highly recommend this resource. So that's pretty much it for the components. Let's go back to the top. Let me give you my kind of final thoughts on this part of the rules video, and we'll talk about what's coming up next. Alright guys, that's Ceti Planetary Crisis. I realize that most of this video has been very much academic, but I wanted to show the components and give you a good overview. Now, I am going to do a separate video for setup, and when I do that video, then I will cover the specific actions, which I know is a considerable part of the game, but I just really wanted to go through and talk kind of about everything in general in this video, so hopefully it will help somebody. I will go back and put timestamps in this to kind of break up the section so that you guys will know where everything's at, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope somebody finds it helpful. I am going to, like I said, start that next video as soon as I possibly can. So just thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. And let's get our game on, right? Let's enjoy some Ceti Planetary Crisis by Outer Limit Games. Thanks, guys.